Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and it's time to update my tier list for all of the tier 8 and also now the tier 9 premium tanks that are inside World of Tanks. So go get yourself a snack, a drink, nestle down and prepare for one of the longest videos of the year, because we've had more premium tanks I think go into the game this year than probably ever before. I think there's about 10 new vehicles at least. And so enjoy the next hour or so as I'm going to be condensing down what is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of gameplay into what are the best premium tanks of 2022 and what will be rolling on into 2023. So firstly, a tier 9 heavy tank. This is the WZ-114. The WZ-114 is a bit of an enigma because it's one of the only tier 9 premium heavy tanks in the game. It's currently making bonds and a decent amount of credits. It's got great penetration on its standard rounds, great penetration on its premium rounds, 10 degrees of gun depression. It's got more hit points than most tier 10 tanks. But unfortunately, it has abysmal gun handling with some of the worst damage per minute possible, and so it doesn't even really make that much damage in a game. However, it just seems to last, and as long as the game isn't a 2 or 3 minute round, this thing just manages to clap quite heavily. And so I'm putting this thing in the great performers section because it's actually very relevant for all players. Now, if you're a very, very good player, you're probably going to be doing better in something else. But if you're actually a below average player, this thing might actually prop you up with its increased durability. Now we're going to be looking at the 112, and I'm going to put this thing up in the super competitive section. I really think the 112 is amazing, and I think it's sleeper OP. That is because it's got 250 millimeters of heat pen. It never has to meet tier 10 tanks. It's got 6 degrees of gun depression. It doesn't have the best accuracy, but you can improve that with an aiming device if you want. The vehicle's fast, and it's also got a lower plate that tier 6 and tier 7 tanks really just can't even pen if you know how to use it. Sure, it's got some weak points on top, but this thing is a go-to clapper of a tank. And while definitely preferential matchmaking is not as good as it used to be, I still really like the 112. Now let's talk about the 111, and this vehicle, in my opinion, is just a worse version of the 112. I'm going to put it in the avoid section because it's just pretty much a worse 112, and you'd never want to get this one if you could get yourself the 112. Now, wow, controversy right here, right now. It's the brand new Chinese heavy tank, the BZ-176, and this one is going in the I hate now. No, it's got to go. It's in the pay to win section, boys and girls. I think this is going to be the new best tier 8 premium in the game if you're a half decent player and you're willing to spend some credits to make some credits. And that's because it has expensive premium rounds. These high explosive rounds have 800 alpha damage, 225 millimeters of pen, and even if you don't pen, you're still guaranteed to do some damage as long as you actually hit the enemy tank. Now the vehicle does have quite a lot of bad aspects, aka its accuracy and its mediocre gun handling, but it has a 160mm caliber gun that's hit harder than any of the other vehicles in this comparison, at least with decent amounts of penetration and not kind of your low penetration HE rounds like you might get on an ISU 152. And also it's got blooming rockets on it, so you can just race into position and clap people. I've been having better win ratios and, more importantly, better average damages in this vehicle than pretty much all of the other tier 8s, and I think it even trumps the Skoda T56. Talking about the Skoda T56, it's next on the chopping board, and I think this one still has to go into the pay-to-win section, but I personally think that the BZ-176 is better than the Skoda T56. In shall we say, nice matchmaking? But I think when you end up against tier 10 tanks, the Skoda T56 is better than the 176. And that's because you could load gold on the Skoda T56 and you've got just better penetration. And because it's AP rounds rather than high explosive rounds, that means you've got normalization. So it's a lot easier to pen. And most tier 10 tanks don't really have that weak armor that you can try and take advantage of, like on the BZ-176. So a lot of players will struggle on the 176 because they won't know about how all of the armor piercing rounds work with regards to overmatching. You won't know those kind of plates or wait for your opportunities. And so I'd say the BZ-176, it will be the easier tank to play in a nice matchup, but as soon as you get against tier 9 and tier 10 tanks that know what they're doing, and more people will begin to know how to play against that thing, then the Skoda will probably be better in those scenarios. Okay, now onto an old school tank. It's an FCM 50T. This vehicle, it's got preferential matchmaking. It's in between the decent choices and the alright situational for me. In some ways, I want to put it in the decent choices because when it actually gets going and uses its 90mm caliber gun and preferential matchmaking, it's not bad, but it's alright in situational because it just doesn't have the armor to be able to deal with all of the other overpowered premium tanks inside the game. And so I'm going to put it in the alright situational section. Now let's talk about the Liberté. This one has to go right in the decent choices because it's just an all-round performer. It's not something that I would choose to buy with any regards, unless maybe you just absolutely love French heavy tanks and you really want to have something to help train up your AMX M454 crew, which there's a lot of people wanting to train up their AMX M454. But it's still not bad. It's got a decent gun, it's got decent armor. Sure, it's got a weak point on top, but as long as you keep moving, it's quite easy to hide. And it is just a decent performer. All right, now the Samoa SM. This thing packs 5 100mm rounds. That's 1,500 alpha damage, well, that it can deliver over its magazine. That's crazy. And this thing has 10 degrees of gun depression to go with it. And unlike something like an AMX 5100, it actually has armor as well. This one, it's between the super competitive and great performers section. It's tough. I think I'm going to put it in the great performers, and that's because the more of the overpowered heavies that we see go into the game along with the Škoda T56, it kind of just makes this thing feel a little irrelevant. Don't get me wrong, the Samoa SM can still be an absolute terror in positions that even a Škoda T56 can't with its 10 degrees of gun depression, but whenever I really choose to play a vehicle that has to spend 5 seconds to deal 900 damage now, when you could rocket boost into a position and just dump out an 800 damage shell on your opponent without having to actually faff around with the magazine. All right, now the Mauerbrecher. I'm not going to say I hate this tank, even though I think it's truly awful. I'm going to put it in the avoid section because it's kind of fun in some weird, twisted way. If you are a masochist, you could be able to get yourself this vehicle, or you could just buy it for one of your friends as some kind of like a joke, really. It's kind of the tank that you would probably give to your friend if you wanted them to slowly lose their mind. So I don't know, you can have their World of Tanks account. And then you get a Mauerbrecher and you probably sell it for credits. Definitely not a good investment when you think about it, but that's how I feel about the Mauerbrecher. I'm not going to say I hate this tank because it's still got some semblance of hope and it's got a bit of a soul, unlike a lot of vehicles that are in the game. All right, now the VK7501K. This one has to go in the alright situational section because while it does hit hard, 490, 490 isn't that special these days with Wargaming introducing more crazy vehicles. And while it can side scrape like a boss, its turret armor just falls apart. It's got pretty bad DPM and its mobility means that you're choosing between a vertical stabilizer or a turbo on this tank. And that's if you want to use vents and a gun rammer because you want to actually be able to shoot your opponents, which is kind of useful. Next, the E75TS. This thing I think goes in the great performers. Fabulous turret, fabulous mobility, and enough hull armor to be able to deal with tier 6s and tier 7s. And also it's really nice for ramming. So I like this one a lot. Lerva. Oh, it's okay. It's in between the decent choices and the alright situational. It's so sad that these original tanks are not still up here, but that's just the way that power creep works. I'll probably put it in the alright situational section because this tank's expensive and it doesn't have preferential matchmaking. I wouldn't ever really choose to buy a Lerva, but if you got one on your tank, there's no harm in playing it if you need a bit of extra German crew training. So now let's talk about the Passante. I really like the Passante. I'm going to put it in the super competitive section. I know that some people are going to want to put it down here, but I actually think this tank is really good. How can you go wrong with 305mm shells able to do 360 damage each with 10 degrees of gun depression, good mobility, and enough armor? A lot of players gave this thing a very bad rep, but I don't see why. It's still one of my go-to tanks that I will actively just play because it's kind of fun to have an auto reloader and to be able to reload the shells one by one and then to be flexible enough to deal with the situation. Fun tank. I really like the Passante and I think it's a very competitive vehicle to play if you're a good player. Now for this year I've decided to bring as I've played on my Asia account this year on the Southeast Asia server, I decided to bring the Nameless into the mix. This thing back in the day used to be pay to win or super competitive. Now I'd probably just put it in the great performers or decent choices because let's be honest, time has gone on over the last 6 years since this vehicle was introduced. I'll probably put it in the great performers because it's the only Japanese heavy tank in the game and we don't even have it on the European server. And go check out my video on the Nameless if you're wondering what this thing is. And it comes with an anime crew that is not the Girls in Panzer. It's from, I think, Valkyria Chronicles. And yeah, it definitely blew my mind when I first heard those crew voices. All right, now let's talk about the 50 TP prototype. I'm putting this thing in the great performers. How can you go wrong? 440 alpha damage, 8 degrees of gun depression, which goes up to, I believe, 10 degrees over the side of the tank, which is kind of just like the Polish Defender. This thing's awesome. It's got nice turret armor. It does have a bit of a weak point on top. Its hull is pretty good, especially against 6s and 7s. I don't know how you can really go wrong with a 50 TP prototype. And I'd say that very, very good players will do better in a 50 TP prototype than they will do in a Defender. But for the vast majority of players, you're going to do better in a Defender because you can rely on that idiot-proof armor. All right, so now a tier 9 heavy tank. It is the Stridsvagn K. This thing, just straight in the decent choices, it's just such an all-rounder. I don't think it's as competitive as the 114 for everyone, but there's no shame in this tank. And as it makes bonds, yeah, it's all right, but I wouldn't probably choose to play this one for what's coming up in a few goes. So next up, the Emil 1951. I think this thing's a great performer. Just basically just sit in front of your opponents with 12 degrees of gun depression and farm them. I think the issue is that it just has a very long reload, and now its turret armor is becoming less and less special as there are higher and higher penetration rounds in the game, and the Emil 1951 definitely suffers against a lot of the tier 9s with very good premium pen. Your turret just can't hold up against some of the tanks going into the game like the 114 now, or even the Stridsvagn K that we just talked about. It's still a decent tank, and I'd say it's a great performer. All right, now the Tornvang. I'm going to put the Tornvang in the super competitive section, or at least I would do if everybody knew how to play hold down. For me, I have one of my best win ratios on my entire account on this tank. And I don't think it's just because I'm getting lucky. It's because any tank that has an impenetrable turret with 10 degrees of gun depression, decent alpha, and enough penetration to go to boot, if you know the maps, you can just go sit there and deny an entire flank to the enemy team. But there are still so many people who probably don't know the positions and don't play this vehicle. And I think one of the reasons why this vehicle has probably worse statistics than it deserves is because a lot of the good players are not wanting to play this boring tank. So I'm going to put this in the great performers section, because while I personally think it could easily go into a super competitive section for me and my play style, which to be honest, my playstyle is nothing like the Tornvang. I don't want something slow. I don't want something with low DPM. I want to go get in there and raid the enemy team. This vehicle, however, I can't deny that it's actually an incredibly competitive tank, and people who want to just have a T-34 that's actually better for 2022 will really like the Tornvang. All right, next up, the Chieftain Prototype. I want to put the Chieftain Prototype in the super competitive section because I just think it's an absolute performer. An incredible turret, an okay hull, but it does have some weak points, especially if you're side scraping in this vehicle, and hardly any weak point on top of the tank with a very nice pokey gun. I feel like the Chieftain Prototype is wargaming taking premium tanks at tier 9 already to being just as good as their tech tree counterparts. And while you could go and play an AE Phase 1, you definitely could go and play a concept, this is still early days for the wargaming power creep at tier 9, and this is as far as they've taken it so far. I would say it's the best tier 9 premium heavy tank out of all of them, and I'd say it's probably arguably the best tier 9 premium tank all in all. Definitely worth picking up if you can get your hands on one. It's just such an easy way to farm some bonds and farm some credits. All right, now let's talk about the Charlemagne. This is a tier 8 British premium heavy tank that has 440 alpha, 10 degrees of gun depression, and a pretty darn good turret. The only issue is, again, a bit like the 114, bad DPM and not the best mobility. But with good gun handling on this vehicle, but terrible accuracy, you could easily slap yourself an aiming device on this vehicle, and it easily goes into the great performers section. I think the real thing that holds this thing back is it costs bombs. And so while it is a premium tank, unless you've got a lot of time to be able to play ranked, to be able to earn a big discount off this vehicle, I'd never really truly recommend spending the most important currency in the game on this tank. It's got a lot of competition. Next up, we've got two vehicles that look the same, but you're going to have to just believe that the first one that I put in is the Caliban. The Caliban, people would want to put it in the alright situational. I'm going to have to put it in the decent choices. But for fun, I want to put it up in the super competitive or great performers section. In fact, I'm not going to put it in decent choices. I'm going to put it in great performers, because if you're a good player, you will be able to do amazing things with this vehicle. One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make with the Caliban is they don't just fire gold. And the gold on this tank is actually quite cheap. It's about 4,000 credits a shot, but that's doing 600 damage. And when you consider that people are willing to currently spend 7,200 to do 800, which is only a third more for pretty much double the price, I think that a lot of people, if they were to give the Caliban a true try with the AP rounds on it, would actually end up doing quite well. I really enjoy the gameplay in it as well. It's a very flexible tank that can also provide a lot of drama and a lot of fun, and I'm all for that. Next, the Gonzalo. The Gonzalo isn't owned by that many people, as Wargaming put it out for, I think, only about like 10,000 players or something for an amount of gold. It actually went for min bid on the European server. It's alright. I think it's got to go into the same kind of branch as the Caliban. And to be honest, if you're not the best of players, I think you'll do better in the Gonzalo than you would do in a Caliban. I think it's the better tank all round, but it's not better for fun. And remember, this tier list isn't just about what the most competitive premium tanks are. It's about, will you have fun or enjoyment or also make some credits at the same time? And so the Gonzalo, if it does appear again, it's definitely worth a look. But I think there are better choices inside the game. Next up, the Carnarvon Action 10. It's just got to go in the decent choices section. I can't really recommend getting a Carnarvon Action 10 when you could have a BZ176, but the great DPM on this vehicle is nothing to flinch at. I think the downside of the Carnarvon Action 10 is it's pretty much just worse than its tech tree counterpart, the regular Carnarvon, but this one, of course, makes credits. But I'll put it in the decent choices section. Unfortunately for it, there are far more interesting British heavy tanks that you could be able to get your hands on now, and so it's definitely suffering, but it's not a bad tank by any means. Next up, let's talk about the Chrysler. It's all right. Again, it's a side-scraping tank. It has bad penetration in its standard rounds, but its armor is really good. But again, when you get into tier 10 tank, this thing feels awful. I wouldn't really recommend it. It's got a very weird playstyle, very different. But if the idea of playing an American side-scraping tank with armor that can just render quite a few vehicles just irrelevant in front of you appeals, then you know what? Look no further. Next up, Renegade. I'm putting this one straight into the super competitive section. While there are arguably better heavy tanks that are kind of cresting World of Tanks now with autoloaders or bigger alpha damage, the Renegade is still just such a beast. It's got everything: mobility, firepower, gun handling, view range, so you definitely don't ever need coated optics on this tank, even if you're a free-to-play player. Pack that in with the field mods, and this thing's probably got better view range than most medium tanks at tier 10, let alone it being at tier 8. And this thing's just outrageously good. Sure, you got a weak point on top. You just got to ignore it and just keep pushing and just keep hoping that your opponents are going to miss it, and just make sure you hit your shots, which you likely will do. And then you're going to be able to out-trade them with your higher DPM. All right, so now the T77. I'd put this thing in the alright situational, because even though I constantly play this vehicle, because it's an autoloader and I like playing autoloaders to farm, they're quite fun to play, I just don't ever really see myself having good games in this vehicle. And so I can't imagine that there will be players out there who would also not at least struggle a little bit with this tank. I feel like it's probably better than all right in situations. A decent choice if you need an autoloader, but I just can't really recommend it, because even though I've tried to make this thing work, and I've had a few good games throughout the year, it's just not quite right with that ultra long reload and horrible gun handling. Okay, let's talk about the T34. I'm going to put this thing in the decent choices. You know what? You can sit there on a ridgeline, you can sit hull down. The The problem with the T-34 is there's just better tanks, like the Tornvang. Tornvang's just basically a better T-34 for this year, and you'd be crazy to want to play something like a T-34 when you could play any other vehicle which has an identical playstyle, like a BZ-176. You could play yourself the Chieftain prototype. You could play yourself a Stridsvagn, and you make bonds at the same time. So yeah, T-34... I'm never going to put it down below a decent choice because it still is, but it's just not really worth it in 2022. Next, the M4Y. This is just such a nothing tank, it really is. It could probably easily slip into the great performance section because it does have hull armor, it does have turret armor, it does have mobility, but it does have a weak point on top. It's basically a worse Renegade, I'd say. It does have the reserve track mechanic, which I guess is useful very occasionally in being able to pull back round a corner. But honestly, I think Wargaming thought the reserve track mechanic was actually going to be way better than it actually ended up. So I'm going to put this thing in the decent choices section, but keep in mind that it could slip into the great performers. But honestly, I would never choose to play this thing when I could play a Renegade. Next up, the Patriot, a vehicle that's available for bonds. I'm going to put it in the decent choices section. Back in the day, I used to put this thing up in the super competitive. As the years go by, hopefully it's going down the list. It's still okay, but I have to admit, 240 alpha damage these days, it's just not right. There are far better vehicles that you could be able to pick that have better armor. Next, the Mutant. This one's going straight in the I hate it section, because Wargaming should have never sold this vehicle after they released World of Tanks. This was a vehicle that was only meant for people who were founders of World of Tanks, people who ponied up, I think it was like $100 of gold to buy the game in 2011, a free-to-play game. Can you imagine that? An unknown free-to-play game by a Belarusian company, and people paid $100 to be able to get the Founders Pack. And then Wargaming made an idiot of them on April Fool's Day about 5 or 6 years later because they sold the vehicle for like $50 inside the store, effectively rendering the ultra rare tank that should have stayed ultra rare not so rare anymore. And so Wargaming that day made an idiot out of 3 people. 1, themselves, because they went back on a promise. 2, their founders. And also, thirdly, everybody who bloomin' bought this tank on April Fool's Day, because it's really not all that good. Outside of preferential matchmaking, it's slow, it's got bad gun handling, bad DPM, and it's got an awkward gun, and your weak points on the vehicle just feel more frustrating than interesting. So I'm going to put that one straight into the I hate it section. All right, now on to all of the Soviet heavies. There's loads of them. This one is the IS-5. I'm going to put it in decent choices because with the 7 degrees of gun depression that this vehicle got, it's not bad. And I believe you can also buy it for bonds. I'd say you should probably get this one instead of the Patriot, but I can't really justify putting it in the great performers because its gun handling feels awful. And unless you have a very good equipment setup on this vehicle, it just feels as if it's just a bit too slow. And I think this tank really does scale well with things like vents and a premium consumable and having every single crew skill on your driver imaginable. But until you get that, it just feels really slow. And so there's a reason why people aren't playing this. And I'm going to actually dump it in the alright situational section purely because of that. Now the IS-3A. I want to put this one in the super competitive section, but I think there are starting to be other autoloaders which are maybe taking a little bit of its shine away. You know what? I don't care. I'm putting this thing straight into the super competitive section because I still think it's an absolute banger of a tank. How can you go wrong with a 3-round 122mm autoloader that has up to 270mm of penetration that actually the DPM increases the more that you fire it? So you can go in and go, I hold down mouse button, and then you're firing faster after that. It's kind of like an idiot-proof autoloader, and it's got okay armor, and you'd have to do really bad to not do at least 1,000 damage in a battle, even in a terrible matchup in this tank. And quite often, you get into like those sweet matchups, and you're going to make those tier 6 and tier 7s wince as you're able to remove them in a single clip and then start reloading faster to be able to deal with all of the others. Next, let's talk about the Kirovets. I'm putting this thing straight into the I hate it section. Look, if I had to take this one seriously, I'd probably put it into decent performers, or decent choices or great performers, or maybe even the super competitive section. But I disagree with this vehicle in every single way. It was a vehicle that was released with an Object 703 hull with pretty much like an IS-3 turret. And it just has a single shot version of the 703-2's gun. And also, more importantly, I hate the way that Wargaming released this tank. And that is, they sold it for 15 million credits at a time where a lot of people were quite credit dry. And to be able to earn the right to see this tank, you had to gamble credits. And I had to spend 5 million credits gambling before I had the privilege of purchasing this tank. So screw you, Wargaming, for the way that you released this tank. And yeah, I'm going to leave it in the I hate it section. Whenever I play it, I also just feel salty and that I'm like a manipulated rat in a maze, just going through Wargaming's like capitalism machine as well. It's disgusting. All right, let's talk about the KV4 Kraslavsky. This thing, I would have put it in the alright situational, but with the buffs it's received, it's definitely going into decent choices, and I'd even almost put it in the great performers. Because when I set this thing up like my KV5, it was a lot more fun to play. When you don't focus on like a gun rammer on this tank, because it's got trash DPM, but you focus on what the vehicle's strengths are, and that is mobility and its weight, you can really bully players with rams and just keep moving and keep being annoying and keep actually making your weak points a more hard target for your opponents to hit. And if you do that, you can actually make it work. Next up, the Defender. I'm still putting this thing in the super competitive section because it really is just so darn easy to play. If you are an average to a below average player, you will do very well with this tank. It's idiot proof. It has got some weak points on the top. Of course, don't let your opponents get the rear of your tank or your side armor, but if you can just keep roughly the front towards your opponents, there are so many tier 8s that I've been playing where I meet these things and I just try and fire regular rounds at them and it just doesn't work. And good luck trying to avoid them hitting you for 440. They're just an absolute apocalypse on the battlefield. And I think one of the reasons why this tank's statistics aren't better is because, frankly, better players have moved on to other vehicles. But this vehicle will still be boosting a lot of people's stats. You can't go wrong with a Defender. Next up, 7032. I want to put this thing in the pay to win section because it's an outrageous heavy tank with a double barrel gun. It's got hull armor that not many people can deal with. It can deliver a 780 alpha damage clap and it's got 270 pen. This thing is still one of my go-tos. In fact, it's probably one of the first premium tanks that I would pick because it's just so fun to have that double barrel, as well as also just being infinitely better than most of the other tier 8 tanks that it meets. The only thing that sucks on this tank is the accuracy. However, this year, what I did on this and also on the Skoda T56 is I stopped using vertical stabilizers and instead I used an aiming device. And it really, really helped out with the gun handling on this tank. So try it, see if it works out for you. Tanks that have fairly good gun handling but terrible accuracy actually scale really well with those vert stabs. With the aiming device instead of the vert stab. So try it yourself. Next, let's talk about the Yadurni. This is a vehicle that I got myself on the Asia server and I played it and I think it's an absolute beast. I think Wargaming are in for a real horror show with how they're going to release this tank now. Because they've released it on the Asia server, which means that they can't really nerf it anymore. It's a premium tank and you can't nerf a premium tank. And I think Wargaming have probably thought, Europe isn't ready for this. We don't really want to create an outrage. And instead, let's release the BZ176 and then maybe put the Yadurni in like a year or a year and a half when the European server has had a little bit of power creep and it won't be so outrageous. Because I can tell you, this thing, after playing it on the Asia server, was outrageous. I'll just show you the armor. I know I haven't really done a tank review on the Yadurni. I probably should. If you'd like to see me do a whole tank review on the Yadurni that I do actually have on the Asia server, you should let me know. But look at this thing's hull. I mean, you're having a laugh, right? Look at that beak. If you angle it like this, or even if you use some of the vehicle's 6 degrees of gun depression, they just can't really do anything to you. And sure, the vehicle has a pretty horrendous gun with regards to its handling, but its DPM is actually really nice and it gets decent APCR and fantastic heat rounds. If this thing hits the European server, I think there will be riots. And Wargaming probably know that. And I think that they're probably doing a little bit of damage control right now with how many of the pay-to-win tanks they put onto the server. Although, you could argue that with the BZ176 that they've thrown caution to the wind. Next up, let's talk about the KV5. I would love to put this thing into the pay-to-win section, but I can't. I'd love to put it in the super competitive section, but I can't. I'd love to put it in the great performers, and I think I can. I can probably about squeeze it in there. I love this thing. It's just my go-to tank when everything is going awful, and I just want to have a little bit of fun. And the KV5 always delivers exactly that. This tank delivers fun in buckets. And while not every game is going to be the one that you want, it's such a cheap thing to repair. Just leave the battle and go play another tank and come back to it, blow off a little bit of steam, and it's just fabulous for that. Driving around without a gun rammer, without vents, my setup that I like to use on this thing would be protection technology with a turbo and with a durability device and just go ram some things and you'll have a whale of a time. And it costs 8,000 bonds. It's like one of the cheapest, coolest tanks that you can be able to get in the game. It definitely has a different playstyle. All right, let's talk about the IS-6. I'm going to throw this thing in the decent choices section. It's definitely not great. It's definitely not bad, however. The vehicle has preferential matchmaking. It never has C tier 10s. But honestly, that doesn't even really feel that special anymore. Back in the day, I'd put this thing in more like the super competitive or great performers, but I'm going to slap it in the decent choices now because I really wouldn't recommend it. All right, so those were all of the heavies. Now let's move on to the mediums. And first up, the infamous Type 59. I kind of want to put this thing in the super competitive section because I really don't know how you can go wrong with this tank. Preferential matchmaking, good gun depression, good armor, good gun, good DPM now, okay gun handling, and enough pen on its gold rounds to be able to smash its opponents. But I think for most people, it's going to go into the great performers. But this is a very, very solid tank. You cannot go wrong with a Type 59. If you have a chance to pick one up at a decent price, yeah, for a while it was considered one of the rarest tanks in the game. Not so prestigious these days. Next up, T-34-3. I want to put this between the alright and situational and decent choices. It's okay. It's got 122mm, preferential matchmaking, 390 alpha damage, and now with the buffed gun depression and intuition changes, you can now have 250 pen when you need it at in a second or two. It's not a bad vehicle, but for me, it's just so frustrating. And it's got the kind of playstyle as to why don't you just play a heavy tank at that stage? Wouldn't recommend it, but again, I can't really throw shade at it. Next up, let's talk about the 59 pattern. I'm going to put this thing in the avoid section. I don't really want to put it in the I hate it section because it's not really offensive to me. This is basically an M48 turret with a terrible extended weak point and the hull of a Type 59. So you're kind of taking kind of like the worst parts of both of the tanks, throwing them together and expecting people to enjoy it. It ain't. Don't buy it. Next up, 122TM. Man, I want to put this thing straight into the pay to win section, but I'm kind of split between that or the super competitive section. It needs to have like its own section of in between. You know what? I'm going to put it in the... I've got to be a little bit more careful with the pay-to-win section. I'll put it in super competitive. And that is because this tank is an absolute treat in every single way. Great armor, great gun, okay mobility, great gun depression, good penetration. The only thing that sucks on this vehicle is that its damage per minute is really poor. But when you can do damage so consistently, I've shown many times in this tank that it's not about having the raw firepower as long as you can actually depend on it and put yourself in the situation and play around the vehicle's poor rate of fire. This thing is a great tank. I'd say it's definitely up there as one of the best tier 8 medium tanks in the game. I thoroughly recommend it. Next, let's talk about the Skoda T27. Now, this in theory should be one of my favorite tanks because I love the Czechoslovakian autoloaders, but I really can't recommend it. And so I'm going to put it in the alright and situational section because you'd be far better to play a Progetto in pretty much every scenario, but I guess maybe some of you are going to be training up your Czechoslovakian medium crews, and if that's you, then that's that. All right, now it's time for the Borask. Straight into pay to win. This is undoubtedly, in my opinion, the best premium medium tank that you can be able to get. 720 damage in 2 seconds, albeit with bad accuracy and okay gun handling. The real thing that makes this thing outrageous is its camo rating is insane. So let's say you get on Malinovka or Prokhorovka, just get your second set of equipment out, get yourself something like a commander's vision system with vents or optics, commander's vision system if you're a pay-to-win player with vents and an exhaust, and then you're kind of just another light tank for your team. And you can totally change the battle into your team's favor. Outrageous vehicle, should be one of your go-tos if you're a very good player for just making credits. The only downside is you do end up firing a lot of gold in this vehicle, so be warned if you're trying to make credits as well as also just grind through the W's. All right, now time for the Alt Proto. I'll put this in the decent choices. It's kind of a bit of a nothing tank. I think it's got 11 degrees of gun depression, and it's all right. It's got armor, and I did get really outplayed by one of these like a few weeks ago, but I really just can't recommend putting it in great performers or super competitive for the vast majority of players. But this isn't one to ignore. There will be a good number of players who just have a slightly more defensive playstyle and want to just get into a position and grind out their opponents that will do well with the old proto. Just for me, I'd never really end up recommending it. Next, let's talk about the Lorraine. I'm going to put this thing as well in the decent choices section. You can't go wrong with the Lorraine. 1,200 damage within about 7.5 seconds of the first shot. The problem with the Lorraine is it's a glass cannon that just takes far too long to load and is not as flexible as other vehicles. Next up, Revalorize. I'm going to put this thing in the decent choices. Why? It's cheap as chips, has preferential matchmaking, and if you want absolutely the best bang that you can get for your buck, when Wargaming are doing a 15% discount on premium tanks in-game for gold, if you were to get a good price amount of gold, then this could be one of the cheapest tier 8 premium tanks you could get your hands on. But it's definitely not going to be the best tier 8 premium that you're going to get your hands on. Next up, CDC. It's either in the decent choices or the situational. I think mostly situational for me. And that is because no matter how much Wargaming buff this, unless they do something really outrageous, like give it 2,400 DPM and 300 alpha damage, I can't ever really imagine myself wanting to play a glass cannon tank. And that's exactly what this vehicle is. It's a glass cannon medium that just doesn't really fit in 2022 when other vehicles have better alpha damage autoloaders or just actually have some armor. Next up, Panther 88. This one's going into the avoid section for me, which kind of pains me to do because it is a classic German medium tank. And while it does have the best rate of fire and the best DPM, I believe, of any of the tier 8 mediums, it's just, again, like a CDC, a big old flappy hull and not flexible or fast enough with terrible camera ratings you always get caught out. Next, let's talk about the Mutz. Decent choices, it's alright. It's nothing special. It's got some armor, it's got a gun, it's got nice HE rounds. So make sure you get intuition on this one if you want to really take your Mutz gameplay up. But there are better medium tanks that you could play. Now let's talk about the Raumpanzer. Again, I'll put it in the avoid section because, well, you can end up doing okay in this vehicle. It truly is a soulless mess. The only way that I've managed to make this thing fun is by giving it fuel and a turbo and vents and just actually making it go quickly. After that, I could never recommend it. Next, the Kampfpanzer. You know what? This one's either between the super competitive or great performers section. I'll probably end up putting it in great performers. I really like this vehicle, however. It does suffer a little bit with regards to the armor. The turret is not good. The hull can provide some surprising ricochets. But what's lovely about this vehicle is great damage per minute that goes up to 11 whenever you can manage to penetrate high explosive rounds. And with intuition in the game now, there's never been a better time to play vehicles that have good HE rounds. Next up, Progetto. For me, it's a great performer. How can you go wrong with an auto reloader that has great DPM irrelevant of what shell you're on, as well as the mobility and flexibility to be able to use it? When Wargaming effectively buffed this tank, when they gave it a 4th equipment slot, and no, I'm not making a mistake there, when Wargaming removed gun rammers from all of the Italian auto reloaders to effectively nerf them, they actually decided to buff the Progetto's rate of fire so that it was if it had its gun rammer, but it doesn't have to use a gun rammer anymore. So it was a significant buff even, not a birth, to a vehicle that didn't need a rebirth, at least with regards to how good its statistics were. Next up, this is the Edelweiss, a generic Japanese medium that's only available on the Asia server, and I think it's got to go in between decent choices and alright situational, because it's just a very well-rounded tank, but it just doesn't really feel like it's that good in 2022. Now the STA2, again, I gotta put it in the decent choices because you don't have any other choice to play a Japanese medium tank, at least on the EU or the NA server. And while it's never going to be the best tank you're going to play, I actually end up having fairly okay games with this vehicle. That's because it's got decent gun handling, 10 degrees of gun depression, and enough mobility to be able to use it. But really, there are far better tanks that you could be able to spend your hard-earned cash on. Now let's talk about the CS52 Lease. It's going great in the great performers section, although players who end up really enjoying this vehicle, which is fine, it's a good Polish medium, might want to put it into more of a super competitive section. Not for me, however. 7 degrees of gun depression, decent armor that when you're using your gun depression can work very well on the front hull. It does suffer a bit when your opponents fire gold rounds at its turret. Has a good gun, especially on the gold, but not the best gun. I just think that there are better tanks that you could be able to play, but still, with the CS63 being so competitive, especially as we saw in Onslaught, never been a better time to get this one out and train up your Polish mediums. Next, let's talk about the Sabaton, aka the Stridsvagn 81. I'm going to put this thing in the avoid section because it's one of the worst Centurions in the game. The only advantage of this vehicle, I believe, is it gets APR as standard or APCR as standard, but that's not actually an advantage if it has the same amount of pen, because remember, all you get is 2 degrees less normalization on your shells, which means that you need more penetration to be able to go through the same plate that an AP shell would. Next up, the Lansen. Great performer for me. Love myself a little bit of Lansen. It's a decent tank. 10 degrees of gun depression, 320 alpha, great DPM. I had my highest experience game of the year of 2022 in the Lansen, and maybe that makes me look through rose-tinted glasses a little bit at this vehicle. But really, this thing can be a very much surprising Viking Raider for very aggressive players. Don't play this thing if you're not aggressive. If you don't want to rush into the fight and just try and dominate the early positions and be a bit of a Viking of the battlefield, don't play this tank. Next up, FV4202. Yeah, it's a decent choice, alright situational. This thing used to be a tier 10 British medium back in the day, would you believe? Although it did have a much better gun with 105mm. It was one of the first ones that used HESH in the game. However, this tank doesn't even have HESH. You'd think it'd be one that would, and it's just the kind of like the tank that time forgot. So I'm going to put it in the alright situational section, because while you can end up on a nice position on a ridge line and really grind out your opponents, I just think that it's just so unspecial because there are other vehicles that you could be playing. Like the the Chieftain T95. This vehicle was available in Halloween crates, and I'm going to put it straight into the avoid section. And that's because it's just not very good. Horrible weak point, not a very good gun, have to fire a lot of gold, and even when you do fire gold, it's got awful pen. I believe that this is one that Wargaming will buff soon, because now it's no longer a Clan Wars exclusive tank, and it has been available for the entire player base, so to say. I think that Wargaming will buff it and then they'll sell it. So I do expect that Wargaming will do some dramatic changes to this vehicle, but until they do, I would never recommend getting this tank. Next, let's talk about the Centurion 5-1. This one is either a great performer or it's a decent choice. It's never the best tank, it's not super competitive, but depending on what kind of a player you are, more aggressive players, or better players as well, will probably do better in something like Lansen. But if you need a little bit of turret armor, a little bit of dependability on the gun, or if you're a player who absolutely, utterly never wants to fire gold, this one's actually got really good penetration. And so for those kind of players, it's a great performer. For everyone else, it's a decent choice. I'm going to put it in the decent choice section. All right, so now we're on to the American mediums. This is the T25 Pilot. I'm going to put it in the alright situational section. This vehicle has some mobility and you can do well in it, but honestly, if you do well in this tank, you will have done better in pretty much most of the other premiums in the game. I would not recommend getting it, but I'm not going to put it in the avoid section because it's still okay in some scenarios. But those scenarios are usually good players playing a tank that is frankly mediocre well. All right, now the TL1. LPC, the Offspring tank. Yeah, it's either a great performer or a decent choice. Again, just so irrelevant in the game. I really wouldn't recommend spending big bucks for this, and you usually will have to because you're going to get it with a Offspring crew. It's a good vehicle, but there's just nothing really to talk about with it. Next up, the T42. Again, this vehicle's either in the avoid section or the alright situational. This is Wargaming basically like taking a pattern, dropping it down to tier 8, but it still somehow manages to just fall on its face because it just has nothing really to enjoy that much about it. Sure, it's got some gun depression, a gun, but you know what? Most of the other tanks in the game have got a gun depression in the gun. And it was a collaboration that they did with The Boys, which is a really cool show on Amazon. I love watching it. Can't wait for the next season. However, that's not enough to really make me enjoy this vehicle because I want something that will be as, you know, as powerful as Homelander. I don't want something that's just a bit wishy-washy on the battlefield. Next up, Astron Rex. Oh man, I'm slapping this straight in the super competitive section. How can you go wrong with a 5-round 105mm autoloader with 10 degrees of gun depression and enough armor to be able to use it? Sure, it's got a weak point on the top of the tank, but if you set this thing up correctly, in my opinion, with vents, accuracy and a turbo, this thing is a terror of the battlefield. One thing I will say is this is a vehicle for the average and the above average player, and casual players will not do as well in this tank as maybe they would do in a 122 TM or other vehicles that we're going to talk about in just a second. And so keep that in mind, as not every tank is always the right choice for every player. Next up, the AMBT. I'm slapping this one right alongside the Astron Rex. This thing is an absolute terror. The first American auto-reloader with 305mm rounds, 360 damage a shot. How can you not love having, I think it's the 9 degrees of gun depression that this vehicle has? It's a brand new tank for 2022, and it is one of my most played premium tanks of the year. I love this thing so much that I decided to put Bond vents on this thing, as auto-reloaders scale incredibly well if you're able to improve their rates of fire. And Bond vents is the best way to be able to improve the rate of fire of this vehicle, along with a premium consumable and Brothers in Arms, because obviously you can't use a gun rammer. Definitely check this one out, and it's available currently inside the loot boxes as, I guess, the bogey prize if you don't manage to get yourself the BZ-176 or the next tank that we're going to be talking about, which is the Iron Arnie. This one, for me, it's going straight into the pay to win. I've been playing this thing, and unless I've just been getting incredibly lucky, it's really hard to suck in this tank. For all of the reasons that I talked about in my tank review, it's just got idiot-proof frontal armor. If you use your 10 degrees of gun depression, they can't even see your weak point on top of the tank. And it just feels as if Wargaming have taken all of the statistics of a Super Pershing and just turned them up to 11, apart from the DPM. That's the only downside to this vehicle, but it doesn't stop the 122 TM from winning its games, and at least for me, it hasn't stopped me from winning my games in the Iron Arnie. Thoroughly recommend you check out my full tank review on this, and please, please, please consider using an aiming device on this vehicle. Way, way, way more important than vert stabs, as the vehicle's gun handling is pretty good, but what is tragic is missing those shots that you could hit. Next up, Ripper pattern, and it's pay to win. No, yeah, of course. No, come on. The Ripper pattern's a joke. If you even compare this thing to an Iron Arnie, it is completely laughable. I would put this thing straight into the avoid section. Would not recommend it. The only thing that is cool about this tank is that it is kind of a real pattern at tier 8 that was used in the Korean War, and that's what the emblazoned tiger motif on the front of the vehicle is. It's just that was before Wargaming put styles into the game, and they could just release that style to be able to put on, I don't know, your Pershing or your Patton or any of your American medium tanks of its type. Irrelevant tank, wouldn't bother with it. Next, let's talk about the Super Pershing. This thing's going to go into between decent choices and alright situational. Wargaming have substantially buffed the Super Pershing recently. It's just I still wouldn't recommend it. You'd have to be an idiot to want to play the Super Pershing over an Iron Arnie now, because they're practically the same tank. It's just the Iron Arnie is better than it in every single way. Apart from that, the Super Pershing has preferential matchmaking, but again, that doesn't really mean anything in 2022 like it used to. All right, now we're on to the Soviet tanks. It's time for the T-54 Mod 1. I put this thing in the decent choices. It's not bad. It's got gun depression. It's got really good armor. This is the kind of tank that does very well inside a nice matchup. And honestly, you should probably go and watch, well, I wouldn't do this, but you could go watch my previous videos, my previous tier lists, and I bet you it's slowly but surely working its way down the list. Because power creep. Power creep. This thing used to be, in my opinion, one of the best premiums you could get, because it was just so awesome to have this kind of armor back in the day when more people were actually playing tier 6 and tier 7 tanks. Now it feels like it's a race to the top, where you only go back to tier 8 when you actually want to grind credits, and very soon with all of these tier 9 premiums going into the game, you're probably not even going to want to stoop that low. That's really the game, what it's becoming. And the T-54 Mod 1 is inherently a tank that depends on its armor, is not really going to be long left for any kind of a decent choice, and it'll be very much in the lower echelons as time goes on. Now it's time for the T-44-100. Great performer, all-rounder, that's it. That's all there is to say about the T-44-100. Can't go wrong with it. Guard. All right, I'm going to put this thing in the decent choices because it's got a really big, hard-hitting 122mm, 390 alpha damage, and it's very accurate indeed. This thing, if you're a very good player, will actually be very, very good. But a lot of players will struggle to make the gun work, and they're also going to just suffer with the armor on this tank. I still can't imagine putting it below or higher than a decent choices section because it's just decent. Next up, the Object 274A. This vehicle is a lot like a CS52 lease. And again, I think it's yo-yoing between the super competitive and the great performer section. I'm going to end up putting it in the great performer section as there are just more and more vehicles that are going into the game that are just scaring this thing. You know, the 122 TM, the Iron Arnie, the 2 American auto loaders that went into the game, including an auto reloader. They're just more fun and better tanks to play. But this is still a great tank. It's got great armor, pretty idiot-proof armor. It's got enough view range. It's got enough firepower with great DPM. You really can't go wrong with this vehicle. but there are just probably better tanks to play. All right, so ladies and gents, boys and girls, we're moving on into the light tanks. All right, so firstly, the Taiwanese Bulldog, the M41. I can't really recommend this vehicle. I'm going to slap it into the decent choices section. Its alpha damage is just too low, and it's a light tank that is depending on its firepower. And while I'm not going to say that it can't do well when it gets those lovely situations where it actually gets to dump out all of its rounds, but they're too far and few between. And while it does have now 410 meters view range, which is really nice, and you definitely don't need coated optics on this tank, you're just putting an exhaust on it anyway to make it as reasonably competitive as other vehicles. Definitely not my cup of tea, and I wouldn't recommend it. Now let's talk about the Char 75. Whew, it's a bit of an enigma, this vehicle. It's definitely not a pay-to-win tank, although I'm sure the players who are on the receiving end of 1,200 damage within about 5.5 seconds of the first shot are going to think that this thing is pay-to-win. It's either between super competitive or a great performer. I'd say for me, it's in the great performer section, and that's because there's enough to hate about this tank. Outside of the turbo mode, this vehicle with field mods can go at 57 kilometers an hour if you're not using a turbo. And so that means that if you actually want to have the okay view range this vehicle has at 370 and the okay camo rating that it has, that you have to drive around when you're not using the speed mode. However, as soon as you do, you lose a quarter of your camo and you lose an extra 20 meters base view range, and your gun gets all screwy. So if it didn't have that mode and it was just driving around the whole time, sure, it'd probably be pay to win as hell. But there's enough to dislike about this vehicle that it's not there, and it's either between, it's right on the cusp of either super competitive or great performers. I think ending up in the great performers for me, because the other tier 9 light tanks also do pretty good, and this gun is very hard to tame. If you're an incredible player and you make use of the current bug in the game of interrupting your burst damage with the changing of the travel mode, you could do quite well. Another reason why I really dislike this vehicle is the limited ammunition. And if Wargaming addressed that in the future, this thing could become a lot more fun to play. And it's okay during Christmas, where everybody's making like 50% extra credits. But I can tell you, when your premium consumables run out, when the Christmas cheer disappears, and your credit boost, and you're not running credit boosters left, right, and center, this thing could actually be quite hard to turn a reliable profit on. Next up, let's talk about the EBR-75. This one's going straight into the pay-to-win section. This is the tank for when you play front lines. It's also a terrifying vehicle when you're playing in the random queue. The EBR-75 is getting a little bit long in the tooth now, and I think it's a tank that Wargaming haven't sold in years because they probably admit that this thing is a bit of a blight on the game. And I think that somebody who's in control of Wargaming right now with the balance has said, hey, no EBR-75s. Either that or they're saving it for a very rainy day. The problem with the EBR-75 is that Wargaming have had to give it special matchmaking now. And so it only gets matched up against other EBR-75s, or what usually happens, Lynxes. And that's why I'd say that probably the Lynx probably has one of the worst win ratios I could imagine of any of the tier 8 light tanks. Let's take a look. Where is the Lynx? Yeah, it's down there third from bottom at just over 46%. And that's because the EBR-75s are munching them up. They are devouring their win ratio left, right, and center. And so if you still are lucky enough to have an EBR-75, definitely recommend taking it out onto the battlefield and just blowing off some steam, because it's the best light tank in the game with regards to premium. Next up, let's talk about the ELC-90. All right, if I was doing an honest review, this thing would be in the super competitive or the pay-to-win section, because Equipment 2.0 has made this thing an absolute monstrosity. It can drive around with 56% camo. It can hide in the tiniest little shrubs. You have no chance of being able to spot these things out, and for that, I hate it. Wargaming. This tank is the definition of toxic gameplay. You could train a banana to just push into a position, sit in one bush, the same bush on, and then learn one bush for every single map, and it will be the most horrible thing to have to try and dig out. It creates stale, toxic gameplay that other light tanks are unable to be able to counter, apart from something like an EBR, which will just rush in and be so fast that it gets to proxy spot the enemy tank, ram it, and hopefully penetrate it with HE rounds. I hate the ELC-90. It's probably my least favorite tank to see on the enemy team, irrelevant of what I'm playing, let alone if I am playing a light tank. Next, let's talk about the M41 Bulldog. This vehicle back in the day would definitely be like super competitive. Now, I'd probably just slap it in the same place as the M41D. And that's because, really, you need more than just a gun on a light tank. Sure, the Sheridan can make it work at tier 10, but that's because the Sheridan has outrageous firepower. And while the M41 Black Dog has decent firepower, it's definitely nothing special. Wouldn't recommend it, really. Next, the HWK-30. This one's a little bit better. It's kind of between the great performers and the decent choices section. But again, I just think its gigantic size, I would never truly recommend this vehicle. I think that there are better light tanks that you can pick. And if you really want to play a light tank, you could just go get a Borask and put an exhaust on it. I guess if you absolutely utterly want to train your Rheinmetall Panzerwagen crew, then the HWK might be your best choice. But why would you ever play it? Go play something else. Next up, it's time to talk about the Senlac. Again, probably in the decent choices. It's just such an irrelevant tank. It's big, it's dumb. You'd be best to play a medium tank with an exhaust than play something like this. Apart from when you can penetrate the HE rounds on this vehicle, and then it gets incredibly scary. Next up, the T92 light tank. And again, this thing, probably decent choices or alright situational. There's nothing really to talk about when it comes to T92 light tank. The real downside to this tank has to be the low alpha damage. It just isn't enough to be able to trade effectively. And while you can end up having big scout games in this vehicle, you're probably best to play another light tank in that regards. All right, let's talk about the LT-432. This thing is outrageously good. And so I'm putting it into the super competitive section. You really can't go wrong with an LT-432. It's a fast, voracious light tank that can have two setups. Hopefully one dedicated towards doing damage, where you probably want like vents with a gun rammer and a coated optics, or vents, gun rammer, even with vert stabs. And then one where you're spawning in on those Prokhorovka, Malinovka maps, where you're then going to be using something like vents coated optics with an exhaust, or vents coated optics with a vision system, or maybe you could even go optics, vision system, exhaust on this tank. It's an outrageously good light tank. It's as close to going into the pay to win section as you can. It's a great fun vehicle, and it's the only tank that I've actually spent gold on my free to play account that I've earned from ranked. All right, so now we're on to the tank destroyers. It's the final stretch for the tier review list for 2022. And this is the WZ-120 at tier 9. I'm going to put this thing in the decent choices section. And that's because it does have a really good DPM. It's got the highest DPM of any of the tier 9 premium tanks by far. And so when you do get into a good situation, you can really rip apart your opponents. It's got 560 alpha, great penetration, okay mobility. The problem with this tank is it's got bad armor, and it's also got really bad gun handling, so it does feel very frustrating. And I wouldn't recommend picking up one of the vehicles unless you absolutely utterly want to be grinding bonds all the time while making credits at the same time. Next up, WZ-120 at tier 8. I think this thing is outrageously good. I think it deserves to be at least into the super competitive, if not the great performers section. It's got everything that you need. A little bit of gun depression, incredible traverse speed, a gun that can really tear its opponents apart with great DPM. It's also got really good heat penetration as well. The problem, again, is the gun handling. But if you can tame that as much as you can, this thing will definitely be slapping faces. Next up, it's the Shpatok, aka the TVP 100. This thing for me is super competitive. I love playing this vehicle, but for a mediocre player, it's probably going to go down into the great performers. This thing has DPM, it has HE rounds, it has a fully traversable turret, it's got mobility, its camo isn't even that bad. What is there not to love about this thing? It's outrageously good, and it was one of the easiest tanks to be able to grind, as it was like an extra mission marathon inside the battle pass this year that Wargaming were testing. If you have a chance to get your hands on it and you're a very good player, you will be very surprised at how much you can farm in this tank. However, I will say that this vehicle is also quite easy to be able to get yourself in a tremendous amount of trouble. And if your 250 alpha damage doesn't have the sting in its tail to dissuade your opponents, and your DPM isn't enough to be able to completely stop them, then you are going to get ripped apart very quickly. Next, let's talk about the AMX CDA. This thing's between great performers, decent choices. For me, it's going to go in decent choices. It's never a tank that I would really choose to play or that I would recommend, but there will be players out there who are firm favorites and fans of this tank, and I can completely understand why. It's It's got good gun depression, a good gun, good mobility, and okay armor to boot. It's an alright tank, but I just think that there are better vehicles that you can spend your money on. Next up, the Kanonen Jagdpanzer with the 105mm. I'd probably put this in the avoid section because it's like this sniping medium tank that has mobility, sure, and it's got a dependable gun, sure, but it doesn't have the DPM, it doesn't have the alpha damage, it doesn't have anything that pretty much all of the other tank destroyers have. And these days, it's not enough to just be a good sniper. You also have to have some kind of combat capacity against heavy tanks, or for when you get into those nice matchups to be able to just brush aside the lower tier vehicles, and that's something that this tank just can't do. Next, the Kanonen Jagdpanzer with the 105mm. This one, it's in the avoid section. I'd probably put it in the I hate it section. Actually, no, I'm not going to put it in the I hate it section, just the avoid section, because I kind of used to like playing this tank in some weird way with the 90mm, because you could actually end up getting some pretty good camo rating even when you're firing, and it's also got some pretty nice HE rounds. However, these days it feels like everything's got nice HE rounds, which isn't even special about this tank, and there are far better vehicles that you could be able to play. And I think it's also probably end up with one of the worst win ratios at tier 8, because I guess there are some weirdos out there who still like playing it, or maybe there are some accounts where this is their only premium tank, and I cry a solitary tear for all of you if that is the case. Next up, the Scorpion G. It's either a great performer or a decent choice. I just think the problem with this vehicle is that it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. It's getting a little bit old, and with all of the power creep in the game, with vehicles going in with better alpha damage or with autoloaders, this one just seems a little lackluster. Still, you can't go wrong with a Scorpion. This will be in a much higher level for mediocre players than it will be for very good players. Very good players will probably be able to make other tank destroyers work. I'm looking at you, Spatuk. However, some players need that alpha damage to be able to just deliver that one shot and then maybe fall back around the corner, that don't want to know about how to control the view range or their camo rating like you can do with the TVP 100. And so for those players, the Scorpion G will be very good. Next, let's talk about the Jagdtiger prototype. No, I'm not talking about the Jagdtiger 88. This is a Jagdtiger prototype. This is a tier 8 German tank destroyer that is available on the Asia server, or at least was inside the autumn loot crates. Now, I didn't manage to get one of these, and I wasn't willing to gamble. I would have probably had to spend another 200 euros to be able to get this tank. I do expect we'll see this one on the European server fairly soon, because its statistics don't even really look that scary. It's wargaming taking a Jagdtiger 88, I guess removing its preferential matchmaking and just giving it a better gun. Although when I say better, its DPM is much worse than the Jagdtiger 88, but it's alright. 490 alpha damage and great penetration, a bit like a Scorpion without a turret, and a good old slab of hit points. I'm sure there'll be some people who will end up enjoying playing it. I'd say it'd probably go in the alright situational section for me, but we'll have to see when I actually play this vehicle that I can give you my final opinion. Next, let's talk about the Jagdtiger 88. I'm going to put this in the decent choices section. It's definitely not the best tank you'll ever play, but I can tell you that Equipment 2.0 and the field mods revolutionized the way that you can play this tank. It is a scary vehicle. Awesome stuff in World of Tanks when you get going with crazy rate of fire. And if you use a durability module on this tank, you can have 1,650 hit points with decent depression angles, and you will make your opponents depressed about how much damage what seems to be quite an innocent tank will do to them very quickly. I actually really like the Jagdtiger 88, and it's a good surprise tank for surprising your opponents. Next up, let's talk about the Viperer. This vehicle is either super competitive or it's going into the pay to win section. For me, it's going in the pay to win section. I think it's the best tier 8 tank destroyer in the game, along with another one, which we're going to be talking about slightly later on. It's got 2,000 blooming damage in its magazine. And while it does take a long time, we're talking about 24 seconds to be able to deliver it with a 6-second intraclip reload, that's still 2,000 damage, mate. That's enough to be able to destroy any tier 8 in the game, if not any tier 9 in the game, pretty much. Or, as it usually is the case, multiple tier 6s or 7s. I think it's also a really easy tank to play, and it's a vehicle that never has to shy away from combat. So get yourself vents, get yourself a turbo, get yourself a durability device on this tank, and just get stuck in early. And if it goes well for you, it goes well for you. And if it doesn't, well, you just go play a different tank, right? Very, very strong, if not broken tank in my opinion. Next up, the S1. Decent choice, really is. It's never one that I am going to truly write home about, but it's alright. It's got a really nice pen, so if you absolutely, utterly never want to fire any gold rounds, and if you want to sit at the back of the map, then you will do well in this tank. However, players who just sit at the back of the map with this tank will never really use it to its full potential, as this tank is all about knowing about your opponent's capabilities, and specifically their gun calibers. All 90mm caliber guns and less with armor piercing and APCR rounds will not be able to penetrate this tank reliably unless they hit the weak point on top. However, heat and high penetration HE will be able to make fun of this vehicle. And so it's all about knowing your opponents, and then you can actually play it quite aggressively. In those situations, this vehicle actually feels very fun. But the thing that holds it back is the DPM. And even with the turbo revolutionizing how you can play Swedish tank destroyers that rely on the siege mode, I still wouldn't recommend this one fully for everyone. Next up, let's talk about the G-Saw. I think this thing is super competitive. It's got a 4-round gun with 320 damage per shot. That is 1,280 damage that it delivers within 6 seconds of the first shot. How can you not manage to do well with that? Also, the G-Saw has very nice depression angles, 11 degrees all over the front, and the vehicle's also very fast once you start to get the field mods. The field mods, again, revolutionized this vehicle with how fast it can be on a variety of terrains, and that makes the G-Saw a terrifying prospect to deal with for any tank. Oh, and also, one of the most scary things that people can do with this vehicle is, add like 100mm of penetration. There is a big difference between a G-Saw with 226 pen and a G-Saw with 321 pen. G-Saw's still one of those vehicles that you can just absolutely clap your way through your opponents. It's also a fantastic tank for just dumping out a mag, hiding, and then alt-tabbing, and you got 30 seconds to do whatever you want, even though I wouldn't recommend doing that in World of Tanks. Next, let's talk about the Turtle. And for me, this thing is either in the super competitive or the great performers section, probably more the great performers. There will be a lot of players who just don't play well in the Turtle and bring the tank down for the rest of the players, or shall I say its statistics down for how the Turtle actually plays. This vehicle is about just not caring anymore. You know, after you've played World of Tanks for hours and hours and hours and you've got nothing more left to give, just get your Turtle out, get some vents, get a gun rammer, get a durability device or probably a turbo. It's one of those sets of 3 of the 4, and then just hold down your W key and go and ruin somebody's day. You've got gun depression, you've got incredible DPM. That's all you really need in World of Tanks. Next up, let's talk about a very rare vehicle that's currently on the Asia server exclusive. It's a TL7, and I do expect that we'll see this thing on the EU server fairly soon. It is a Tier 9 American turreted tank destroyer, and while I have played it, I didn't really get a true opportunity to test it on the Asia server, and so let me know again if you want to see a full tank review of this vehicle. Maybe I'll give it a good go. This tank was actually quite hard to play with the 200 to 300 ping that I had though, for sure, so I'm going to have to I'd really love to test this on the EU server. But my thoughts are that this thing is going to be super competitive as a tier 9 premium with a big old magazine. It's able to do 1,440 damage within 6.9 seconds of the first shot, and so you really can't go wrong with a vehicle like this, and I'd keep my eyes on it if you're on the EU or the NA server for it possibly coming this year. Next up, TS5. Bingity bangity bong, pay to win. This is as easy as it can get in World of Tanks. Really, just slap something like Vents, Gun Rammer Turbo, Vents, Gun Rammer Durability, one of those sets of modules, and just hold down your W key and farm your opponents. This thing is outrageously strong in every single situation for a melee town fight. I got farmed by one of these just a few days ago in an IS4, and I think that they were like a 46% win rate player, and it doesn't surprise me. This is the great balancer. Just get your wallet out, throw it at the screen. It doesn't matter who you're going to be playing against, as long as you know roughly about pointing your gun at their direction and firing heat if you need to. You're going to be able to rip apart your opponents. Now let's talk about the KV4 KTTS, which came out. This one's going into the super competitive section for me because it just seems to perform. This thing has hit points, it has armor, it has 360 alpha damage, and it just even has some gun depression to go with it. This thing can ram its opponents just as well as it can also destroy them with its 107mm caliber gun. It was available this year brand new inside the loot crates from the last Waffenträger game mode. And so if you can manage to pick one of these up and you're a little bit of a crazy Ivan player and you want to be able to go in and kick some butt, I do recommend this tank. Next up, the T103. I'll put it in the decent choices section, even though I want to probably put it in the alright situation on. This thing is a freak of a tank. It has an okay turret on a horrible hull with an okay gun. There's nothing really too much more to say. I'd never recommend it, but then again, is it really one of the worst vehicles you're ever going to play? You know what? I'm probably going to put it in the alright situational. Next up, the SU-130PM. This one's going straight into the great performers, if not the super competitive section for me, because field mods and equipment 2.0 really helped this thing out. Now it's got more than enough mobility to be able to get around the battlefield and to deliver claps to its opponents. I'd recommend using coated optics with a gun rammer, and then your choice of either turbo or an exhaust on this tank, and then you will be sneaky enough to be able to get around and just deliver 520 alpha damage claps at unexpected opponents. This one will be even better in a very good player's hands, but I think the more casual players might actually do better with a Scorpion because they would like to rely on the vehicle's APCR rounds instead of heat rounds, and having a fully traversable turret can get people out of a little bit of trouble or making any big mistakes. Gotta love the SU-130PM, it's still one of the best in the game. Next up, ISU-152K. This thing is a decent choice. It's not a bad tank, it's not a good tank. It claps like 750 alpha damage, but it just doesn't really have anything else to like about the vehicle that would deem it worthy of a higher echelon inside this tier review. Sure, it can be fun when the vehicle works, and it will work quite a lot of the time, but I think the SU-130PM will just troll you less. And when you want to play one of these premium tanks, are you playing it because you want a wild ride? Or are you playing it because you want it to consistently deliver you results? Quite often, it's probably the consistently deliver you results, and so pick the more consistent tanks. Next up, the ISU-130. And this vehicle, to all intents and purposes, is an ISU-152 that has a more funky gun. It has better DPM, and it has the availability to lower its penetration with its premium rounds, but to up its alpha damage. And funnily enough, if you do load the gold on this tank and are able to penetrate with 212 millimeters of pen, you actually have one of the highest DPMs in the game. So be warned, if you see the rare ISU-130 on the enemy team, to make sure you don't flinch, otherwise they are going to be ripping you apart very quickly indeed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that is it for every single tier 8 and tier 9 premium tank that's in the game that makes you extra credits. Whew, congratulations to you if you managed to make it through towards the end of the video. If you did and you really enjoyed this and you thought it was useful, maybe this saves you some money over the next year or allows you to know what to watch out for with regards to vehicles to pick up, then make sure you give the video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments, firstly, did I miss any tier 8 or tier 9 premium tanks? And secondly, are there any vehicles that you totally disagree with my positioning? What do you think about all of the vehicles that I put into the pay to win section? And do you think that any deserved to be into the pay to win section that aren't? And also, let me know if you're interested in me doing a tier list for tier 10 tanks this year. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.